So why is the resurrection so important? What is the...
Well, we said earlier, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. He said, I and the Father are one. People recognized that was his claim. They picked up stones to kill him. But so what? I could claim to be God. John could, well, maybe not John. Anybody could claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then came back to life on the third day, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. So for me, as a skeptic, the first confirmation of his claim of divinity was whether or not he fulfilled this prophecy of the Messiah returning from the dead. And I think the evidence is clear. I think it's compelling. I look at it, I summarize it with 4 words that begin with the letter E. That way it's easy to remember. First E is execution. We talked earlier about all the evidence that Jesus truly died when he was crucified. Even the atheist scholar Gerhard Ludemann says it's indisputable that he was dead. Even the Journal of the American Medical Association says that.
Yeah, there's no historian that would doubt that today.
No. So first E is for execution. Second E stands for the word early. We have early accounts that he rose from the dead. In other words, reports that go back virtually to the cross itself. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. Got to give you the fact he was dead. Okay, I give you that. But raising from the dead, that's a legend. It must have taken a few generations to develop in the ancient world. Stories were invented, mythologies were created. That's where I thought it came from. But we have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christians, the first Christians right there in the first century, gathered around this creedal statement based on facts that they knew to be true. It's kind of a rallying point. And this creed says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including 500 people at once, including a skeptic like James, a half-brother of Jesus, who didn't follow Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, and yet ended up dying as a leader of the church in Jerusalem. Why? Because Jesus appeared to him. So we've got this creedal statement that including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses that has been dated back by scholars, including James D.G. Dunn, who is one of the most eminent historians he recently passed, but of the last 100 years in England. It has been dated back to within months of the death of Jesus. So if I can, from memory, quote what Dr. Dunn said, he said, this tradition, this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed within months of Jesus' death. I mean, that is a news flash from ancient history. Far too quick, in my opinion, to be a legend that developed over the 100, 150, 200 years later.
Well, and it's recorded in 1 Corinthians 15.
That's right, if anybody wants to check it out.
Which was written, sometime in the 60s, probably 50s?
No, in the 50s. Yeah.
50s.
Yeah. Well, but we can go back
20
even
years
earlier.
after Jesus' crucifixion. So
But
that's not time for legend to develop.
Not only that, you're right, but within 20 years or so, that would tell us it existed. But we know Saul of Tarsus became the Apostle Paul 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion. So he's on the road to Damascus. He has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Many people believe this is when he was given that creed that he later wrote to the church in Corinth.
Yeah.
Others say it was 3 years later. He went to Jerusalem and he met for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus who were named in the creed, Peter and James. And they had a meeting in Jerusalem for 15 days, and some believe that's when he was given the creed by 2 people named in the creed as eyewitnesses. Either way, that means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence. Therefore, the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. Wow. And then you have a scholar like James D.G. Dunn say, no, it's within months. So this is...
And even Bart Ehrman, doesn't he?
I'm not sure where he's at on that. But I read stuff like...
Can we go through the timeline real quick?
Yeah.
Of what it... So he died on the cross. They put him in a tomb.
Yes.
Why was it 3 days?
Well, why was it 3 days? He predicted, like Jonah was in the fish for 3 days, that he would be coming back in 3 days. So that was kind of I don't think it's a requirement necessarily, but it was 3 days. On the third day, he returned. The Jewish word for day was reckoned as an ona, which is O-N-A-H, and it meant a night and a day is an ona. But any portion of an ona was considered as the whole. And so he died on Friday, he was in the tomb on Saturday, and he rose sometime Sunday morning. That's parts of 3 days that he was in, one day for fully, and parts of 2 others. But according to the Jewish reckoning of time, that's the 3rd day. So he returns on the 3rd day.
You don't think there's any significance to that?
What would you say, John? I'm not. I don't. I think the fact that he did liken it to
call
Jonah.
it the sign of
Jonah.
sign of Jonah. This generation will not be given a sign except the sign. They were demanding. I mean, just think about this. So he had been healing people, raising people from the dead. That's why he had thousands following him everywhere. That's why the Jewish authorities were, and he was also calling them hypocrites because they were playing a religious game. Their hearts were far from God, he said. So they look good on the outside. And go read Matthew 23, man. He just rips them a new one. Seriously, he does. He holds no punches back. And so they are like, we can't put up with this because they are leading Israel astray, away from us and our power and our prestige. And so they decide to crucify him. But they were saying, you're really the Messiah? Give us a sign.
Yeah.
Give us a sign. He said, you're not going to be given any sign. I mean, giving them tons of signs. We talked about all the signs that were already in their scriptures.
In that direction.
I mean, all of it's there, right? He's going to come from Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem. He's going to come from Galilee. He did most of his ministry in Galilee. It's all in Isaiah. They were blinded to it because of their egos and their desire for power and greed and money.
Yeah.
So he says this generation will be given no sign except the sign of Jonah.
Which would be 3 days. So
3 days.
It's a fulfillment of that.
So I think that's the significance.
Yeah, that would be the significance. So you've got the execution, the early, and by the way, it's not the only early report we've got of the resurrection. We have others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, all of which were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries. And they would have pointed out the errors if they were making this stuff up. So we've got an execution, he's dead. We got early reports that he rose from the dead, too quick to be a legend. Third, we have an empty tomb. And we could talk all day about all the evidence the tomb was empty, but the best evidence to me was we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole the body. Now they're admitting the tomb is empty. They're admitting it's empty.
The ones who crucified it.
Yeah, they're just trying to explain how it got empty. It's like if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework. That student's admitting, look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate. It's the same thing. So everybody in the first century, whether they're supporters of Jesus, explicitly saying the tomb is empty, or the enemies of Jesus implicitly admitting it was empty, everybody's conceding the tomb is empty. The real question is, how did it get empty? And you go through the usual list of suspects. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive, they didn't have the means, and they didn't have the opportunity. In fact, I found 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that report that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Why were they willing to do that?
How many died for their faith without recounting it?
And their willingness to die is well established. How a couple of them died gets a little bit misty in history, but their willingness to die, 7 sources tell me that they willingly lived lives of deprivation and suffering. Think about this. Of all human beings who've ever lived on the planet, they were in a unique position to know, is this a lie or is it true? Because they were there. They touched the resurrected Jesus. They talked with them. They ate with them. Of all people who ever lived, they knew the truth. They didn't just believe it. They just had faith in it. They knew the truth. And knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That's the difference between a terrorist today who crashes an airplane into the Trade Center. He believes if he dies that way, he's going to go to paradise. Does he know for sure? No, he couldn't know for sure. He just believes it so much that he's willing to die that way. That tells me nothing about the veracity of his claims. But the disciples were in a position to know for a fact, is this true? Is it false? Knowing it was true, they were willing to die for it. So we have an execution. He was dead. We have early reports, too quick to be a legend. We've got the empty tomb. And then 4th E is eyewitnesses. Over a period of time, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. A lot more than that, but to doubters and to skeptics, to men, to women, to groups, to individuals, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. What I found fascinating in studying this as a skeptic is that when you study ancient history and you're looking at some fact about the life of Alexander the Great, for instance, and you dig down, how do I know this fact is true? Most of the time, it's based on one source, maybe two sources of information. But for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. I can tick them off real quick so you know what they are. The first is that creed I mentioned earlier. A creed whose historical credentials are so strong that one of the few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapid, said it may be taken as a statement of eyewitnesses. Second, we have Paul's testimony, because Paul said, I encountered the risen Christ, and then he got to know the disciples.
Which was just what people around the world are encountering today on the Damascus. And Paul was one of the Pharisees who had Jesus crucified.
Right.
So he was the enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the Taliban now,
No
coming over to our
incentive
side kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And it says on the Damascus Road, he's going to arrest and kill Christians. He was there when Stephen was martyred, given two thumbs up, because Stephen believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And he's like, that's wrong. We're getting rid of these people. When on the Damascus Road, this brilliant God of light appears to him. Sound familiar? All over the world today. This is near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Who are you, Lord? He asked. And he says, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. And Jesus didn't tell him the gospel. He didn't tell him what to do. He said, you'll be told. And then later sends Ananias to explain to him. And Paul still had a choice, because he had a lot to lose.
Yeah.
Is he going to leave behind his power and his prestige and then suffer? Because he did.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's huge,
absolutely huge. And no incentive to do that. But what's also interesting is after he became the Apostle Paul, he became friends with many of the disciples, the other eyewitnesses. So he knew Peter, James, and John. Right. And he says in 1 Corinthians, in his letter he wrote, he said, whether it is I or they, this is what we preach. So he's saying, look, I encountered the risen Christ. So have they. So he's confirming that the disciples were eyewitnesses. He's another point of confirmation. The third area of evidence, corroboration, is the book of Acts. Even skeptical scholars will accept that the book of Acts is the account of the spread of the early church. And what is the thing that drove it? It was a proclamation of the resurrection. So here we have Peter in Acts chapter 2, who gets up before a crowd, and he says, men of Israel, listen to these words. This Jesus, a man attested to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which he did in your midst. You know that he did. He's appealing to their common knowledge. And then he says, this Jesus God raised from the dead, to which we're all witnesses. And how did they react? History tells us that 3,000 people said, Peter, we know you're telling us the truth. What do we do? They repented, and the church was born. So that's the first 3 sources. Then we have the next 4 sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are historical biographies based on eyewitness accounts. There's 9 appearances of the risen Jesus in those 4 gospels. So that's 7 ancient sources. But then,
plus you got Luke, who interviewed Mary.
Oh yeah, there's other sources,
others,
right? But we have sources from people who sat under the teachings of the eyewitnesses. So, for instance, if you still were teaching at your church in Austin, Shawn, if you were to come to his church for 3 years, you'd have a pretty good idea what he believes, right? Yeah. Well, we have writings by people who sat under the teachings of the apostles themselves and can report what they said about the resurrection. So we have a letter that was written by Clement. Clement was, we believe, ordained by Peter himself. And Clement writes a letter in the 1st century to the church in Corinth, and he says that the disciples had complete confidence. Why? Why did they have so much confidence? Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because they were eyewitnesses to the risen Lord. And then Polycarp, who was appointed by John himself to be bishop at Smyrna, he writes a letter to the Philippian church, and he mentions the resurrection 5 times in that letter. And he said, talking about Paul and the other apostles, he said, "For they did not love the present age, but him who died for them and was raised by God on the 3rd day." So he's confirming the teachings of these eyewitnesses that they encountered the risen Christ. That's 9 very early eyewitness-based account or accounts of the corroboration of the eyewitnesses, the disciples who encountered personally the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data.
Can you tell he's a lawyer?
I'm not a lawyer. I just have a law degree.